Listen closely, because history rarely records the truth of how empires fall, or how they are saved. It wasn't a rival army or a poisoned chalice that brought the ruthless Alpha King to his knees on the cobblestones of Oakhaven. It was a 5-year-old boy with bruised ribs and terror in his eyes. The child, small and shivering, shoved past a phalanx of elite guards, his bloody fingers desperately tangling in the heavy black fur of the king's ceremonial cloak. The boy didn't care about crowns or executioners. He only choked out 5 words. "They're hurting my mum, please." And in that frozen second, the most feared monarch of the northern reaches lost his mind. Life in the lower rings of Oakhaven was not a fairy tale. In the year 1244 of the Unified Pax, the medieval trade city was a festering wound of poverty, built on the steep banks of the Blackwater River. The stench of the local tanneries mixed with the permanent scent of wet soot and despair. For Rosalind Hayes, it was the perfect place to disappear. Rosalind was a rogue, though not by choice. 5 years ago, the silver-furred wolves of the Crestwood Pack had been slaughtered in a territorial dispute. Rosalind, the daughter of a minor pack baiter, had escaped the massacre with nothing but the clothes on her back and a life growing inside her. She had shed her family name, bound her scent with bitter ash and crushed wolfsbane, and reduced herself to a simple seamstress in the slums. Her entire world was reduced to the 4 dilapidated walls of her freezing hovel and the bright, untamed spirit of her son, Leo. Leo was small for a 5-year-old werewolf pup. He hadn't experienced his first shift, and without the protective presence of an alpha or a pack bond, his development was stunted. But he had his mother's striking emerald eyes and a heart far too brave for his fragile bones. The winter of 1244 was merciless. The harvest had failed, and the local magistrate, Lord Roderick, decided that the deficit would be paid in the blood and coin of the untouchables. Roderick was a bloated, cruel alpha who ruled Oakhaven under the distant banner of the Alpha King. Roderick didn't care if the winter had frozen the water wheels or if the sickness had taken half the labourers. He demanded the king's tax, plus a heavy administrative fee for his own overflowing coffers. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the terror came to Rosalind's door. She had been returning from the market, clutching a half-rotten cabbage and a small heel of hardened rye bread, her fingers numb inside her threadbare wool mittens. Leo was walking closely beside her, his small hand gripping the hem of her skirt. "Mamma, can we make the hot water taste like pine needles tonight?" Leo asked, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He meant tea. They couldn't afford real tea. "We'll see, my brave little wolf," Rosalind murmured, forcing a tired smile. "Keep your head down. The guards are out." She saw them too late. Blocking the narrow, mud-slicked alleyway leading to their home were 3 of Lord Roderick's enforcers. At their head was Captain Briggs, a scarred, brutish werewolf whose human form was just as ugly as his wolf. He wore the heavy chainmail and crimson tabard of the city watch, a thick broadsword resting casually on his hip. "Well, well, the runaway seamstress," Briggs sneered, spitting a glob of dark tobacco juice into the snow. "You're late on the solstice tax, Rosalind. 3 silver coins. Hand them over." Rosalind pushed Leo behind her, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. "Captain Briggs, please. The decree said we had until the new moon. I just need 3 more days to finish the garments for the blacksmith's wife. I'll have the silver then." The magistrate changed his mind, Briggs said, stepping forward. His heavy leather boots crunched ominously on the ice. The 2 guards behind him fanned out, blocking the only exit. "He wants it today, or he takes collateral." "I have nothing," Rosalind pleaded, her voice cracking as the primal instinct to protect her pup flared to life. She hadn't shifted in years, starving her wolf to stay hidden, but the phantom fangs ached in her gums. "Look at us. Do you see any silver here?" Briggs's eyes dropped to Leo, who was peeking out from behind Rosalind's legs. A wicked, predatory grin stretched across the captain's face. The fighting pits down in the Undercity are always looking for fresh meat, even runts. Hand the boy over to work off your debt, and we'll call it even. "No!" Rosalind shrieked. It wasn't a human sound. It was the raw, guttural bark of a desperate mother. When Briggs reached out a massive, gauntleted hand to grab Leo, Rosalind didn't think. She reacted. She dropped her meager groceries and threw herself at the towering guard. Her fingernails tore across Briggs's cheek, drawing 3 thin lines of blood. The alley went dead silent. Briggs touched his face, looking at the blood on his leather gloves. His eyes flashed an unnatural, luminescent yellow. The wolf beneath pushing to the surface. "You stupid, filthy bitch!" Briggs growled. He backhanded her with the force of a battering ram. The blow sent Rosalind flying backward, her head striking the jagged stone wall of the alley with a sickening crack. She crumpled to the frozen mud, her vision swimming in dark, dizzying circles. The copper taste of blood flooded her mouth. "Mama!" Leo screamed, trying to run to her, but one of the other guards grabbed him by the scruff of his tunic, lifting him off the ground. Leo kicked and thrashed, biting wildly at the air. "Hold the brat!" Briggs ordered, drawing a short, serrated hunting knife from his belt. He walked slowly toward where Rosalind was struggling to push herself up on her hands and knees. Blood poured from a gash on her forehead, blinding her left eye. "You want to act like a feral dog? I'll put you down like one." Briggs grabbed a fistful of Rosalind's dark hair, yanking her head back, exposing her throat. He pressed the cold, biting edge of the knife against her pulse point. In the chaotic grip of the second guard, Leo realized something fundamental. He was too small. He couldn't fight them. But he could run. With a sudden, desperate twist, Leo sank his baby teeth straight to the bone of the guard's wrist. The man howled in pain and dropped him. "Get him!" Briggs barked. But Leo was already gone, scrambling under a wooden merchant cart and sprinting blindly toward the sounds of the main city square, leaving his mother bleeding in the snow. King Silas Blackwood did not want to be in Oakhaven. Known throughout the continent as the Iron Wolf, Silas was a man sculpted from war and winter. At 32, he had ruled the unified Pax for a decade, holding a fractured kingdom together through sheer, unyielding brutality and unmatched tactical genius. He was a massive man, standing well over 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the realm. His hair was the color of raven feathers, and his eyes were a startling, piercing, icy blue that seemed to strip the lies from whoever he looked at. He was a king, but he was also a prisoner. Silas had not shifted into his wolf form in nearly 8 years. His beast was ancient, a dominant primordial spirit tied to the bloodline of the first kings, but the beast was too strong, too feral. Without a mate to anchor his soul and balance the rage, shifting meant risking losing his humanity forever. So, Silas lived in a state of permanent, agonizing restraint. He was cold, calculated, and entirely emotionally detached. Today, he was leading a massive royal procession through the center of Oakhaven. 50 elite King's Guards, clad in black iron armor and mounted on massive destriers, flanked him. He had come to sign the Red River Trade Treaty and audit Lord Roderick, having heard rumors of the magistrate's corruption. The town square was packed with thousands of shivering peasants, all forced to bow in the muddy snow as the king rode past on his midnight black warhorse. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the clinking of chainmail. The sheer pressure of Silas's alpha aura rolled off him in suffocating waves, forcing the heads of every werewolf in the vicinity firmly to the ground. No one dared to look him in the eye, until a tiny, frantic blur of motion broke the formation. Leo was running so fast his lungs burned like they were filled with acid. He didn't understand the banners, the armor, or the unnatural silence of the crowd. He only saw a sea of towering men with swords. He needed the biggest, strongest man there to stop the monsters hurting his mother. "Stop the procession!" a guard shouted as the tiny boy darted between the legs of a rearing warhorse. "Insolent whelp!" another guard roared, drawing his weapon. Leo ignored them. He saw the man in the center, the man wearing a cloak of thick, black direwolf fur, the man whose very presence made the air vibrate. Silas pulled back on his reins as the filthy, bruised child launched himself at his stirrup. The king's guards moved instantly, spears lowering, ready to impale the perceived threat. "Halt," Silas commanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant, physical weight that instantly froze his soldiers in place. Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fistful of the king's heavy fur cloak, his tiny knuckles white, his hands smeared with the blood from his mother's attackers. He looked straight up into the terrifying, icy blue eyes of the Alpha King. "They're hurting my mum," Leo sobbed, his voice cracking, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "Please, he has a knife. They're going to kill her." Silas stared down at the boy. Usually, his first instinct was annoyance, but as he looked at the child, something deeply unsettling happened. A scent hit him. It was faint, buried beneath the stench of the city's mud and the boy's own fear. It was the scent of crushed winter lavender and rain-washed pine. Deep inside the dark, iron-barred cage of Silas's soul, his wolf, dormant, violent and silent for 8 years, opened its eyes. It didn't just wake up. It slammed against the bars of Silas's mind with the force of a falling mountain. "Mine." The voice of his beast wasn't referring to the boy. It was referring to the blood on the boy's hands, the scent of the mother. Silas's chest seized. The breath left his lungs. A mate, his mate. The goddess had not forsaken him. She was here, in this rotting slum, and her blood was currently staining the hands of a crying child. "Who?" Silas whispered, his voice suddenly thick, a deep, rumbling vibration that caused the nearest horses to whinny in panic. "The men with the red shirts!" Leo cried, pointing a trembling finger back toward the maze of the lower city. "In the alley behind the tannery, please!" "General Hawthorne," Silas said, not looking away from the boy. A scarred veteran rode up beside him. "Sire?" Silas swung his massive leg over the saddle and dropped to the cobblestones. The impact of his landing seemed to shake the ground. When he stood to his full height, the icy blue of his eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a swirling, terrifying ring of molten gold. The beast was fighting for the surface. "Secure the perimeter." "No one leaves this city," Silas commanded, his voice now a layered, demonic growl. He looked down at Leo. "Show me, little one. Show me right now." Leo, terrified of this giant, but more terrified for his mother, turned and ran. Silas Blackwood, the Alpha King, followed a street urchin into the slums, leaving his stunned army behind. The scent of crushed lavender grew stronger, but it was being choked out by the sharp, metallic stench of fresh blood and sheer terror. Silas didn't run. He stalked. His every step cracked the frozen cobblestones beneath his boots. The immense, crushing weight of his alpha aura was no longer restrained. It bled from him in dark, suffocating waves. Villagers hiding in their doorways collapsed to their knees, clutching their throats as the king walked past. He was shedding his humanity with every yard he covered. Up ahead, he heard the sickening sound of flesh being struck, followed by a cruel, mocking laugh. "You should have just paid, Rosalind," Briggs's voice echoed from the narrow alleyway. "Now I'm going to carve my name into that pretty face of yours, and then we're going to find that little rat you call a son." Leo reached the mouth of the alley and screamed, "Mom!" Silas stepped around the corner, and the world stopped. The scene burned itself into his retinas. Rosalind was pinned against the freezing brick wall. Her clothes were torn, her face was covered in a mask of her own blood, and Briggs had a serrated blade pressed so tightly to her cheek that a fresh line of crimson was trickling down her neck. But it was her eyes that stopped Silas. Even beaten and bleeding, she glared at her attacker with a fierce, unbroken defiance. And the scent, gods, the scent was intoxicating. It wrapped around Silas's heart like a physical chain, locking perfectly into the empty, rotting spaces of his soul. She was his, the other half of his spirit, and a filthy city guard had a knife to her throat. The thread holding Silas's sanity snapped. "Step away from her," Silas spoke. It wasn't a request. It was the alpha command. It hit the alley like a shockwave. The two guards standing near the entrance instantly dropped to their knees, vomiting blood as the sheer magical force of the king's command crushed their internal organs. Briggs froze. He slowly turned his head, his sneer faltering as he saw the towering shadow at the end of the alley. He didn't immediately recognize the king without his entourage, but the oppressive power in the air made his knees buckle. "Who the hell are you?" Briggs stammered, his hand shaking, the knife still dangerously close to Rosalind's face. "This is official magistrate business. Back off, or I'll gut her right here." It was the worst mistake Briggs would make in his short, miserable life. Silas didn't walk. He moved with a speed that defied his massive size. He was a blur of black fur and unadulterated violence. Before Briggs could even twitch his wrist, Silas's hand clamped around the guard's throat, lifting the 300-pound armored man off the ground with one arm. The knife clattered to the stones. Rosalind gasped, collapsing against the wall, clutching her bleeding neck, her chest heaving. Leo ran to her, burying his face in her stomach. Silas stared into Briggs's bulging eyes. The king's face was a mask of terrifying, unnatural calm, but his eyes were pure, blinding gold. His canine teeth elongated, dropping past his lips. "You hold a blade to what is mine," Silas whispered, his voice sounding like grinding tectonic plates. "You bleed what is mine." Please," Briggs choked out, his legs kicking frantically in the air. "Lord Roderick, his orders." "Roderick will answer to me," Silas said. "But you answer to my beast." With a sickening crack that echoed off the brick walls, Silas simply tightened his grip. The iron chainmail around Briggs's neck bent and shattered like dry twigs. The guard's neck snapped instantly, but Silas wasn't done. In a display of raw, horrific strength, meant to send a message to the deepest instincts of any watching wolf, Silas effortlessly hurled the lifeless body 40 feet down the alley, where it smashed through a wooden cart and lay broken in the mud. The two remaining guards on their knees sobbed, pressing their faces into the dirt. "Mercy, my king! Mercy!" "Guards!" Silas roared. Within seconds, General Hawthorne and a dozen of the king's men flooded the alley, their swords drawn. "Take them," Silas ordered, not even looking at the men. "Chain them in the square. Send a detachment to Lord Roderick's estate. Drag him by his hair to the center of the city. If he resists, break his legs." "Yes, sire," Hawthorne barked, his men immediately dragging the sobbing guards away. The alley was suddenly quiet, save for the ragged breathing of the woman against the wall. Silas turned slowly. The feral rage was still boiling in his veins, but as he looked at Rosalind, it shifted into a desperate, overwhelming need to protect, to claim, to heal. He took a hesitant step toward her. His massive hands, which had just casually ended a man's life, were trembling. "Mate," Silas breathed the word like a prayer. He reached out to touch her bruised cheek. But the twist of fate is a cruel master. Rosalind looked up, blinking the blood from her left eye. She saw the heavy black cloak. She saw the pure gold eyes. And she saw the face of the man who commanded the army that had slaughtered her entire family 5 years ago. Silas Blackwood, the Iron Wolf, the architect of the Crestwood massacre. Her mate was the man who had destroyed her life. Instead of falling into his arms, Rosalind let out a whimpering gasp of absolute horror. She slapped his hand away with surprising strength, pressing herself and her crying son flat against the freezing brick wall, as if trying to merge with it. "Don't you touch us," Rosalind hissed, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated hatred and terror. "Don't you ever touch me, you monster." Silas froze, his hand hanging in the empty air between them. For the first time in his reign, the invincible king of the North felt his heart completely shatter. The rejection hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. The Alpha King, who had stood unblinking before charging cavalry and shrugged off the bites of feral rogues, staggered backward a half-step. The golden fire in his eyes violently flickered, violently clashing with the icy blue of his human consciousness, as his beast howled in agonizing confusion. "Mate rejects us." The primordial wolf in his mind thrashed against its iron cage, the pain radiating through Silas's chest like shattered glass. "Rosalind," Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper, though it seemed to echo off the frosted bricks. He didn't know how he knew her name. Perhaps he had heard the dead guard say it, or perhaps his soul simply recognized the missing piece of itself. I don't understand. I have never harmed you." "Liar!" Rosalind screamed, the sudden exertion causing fresh blood to spurt from the gash on her neck. She pressed a trembling hand against the wound, her emerald eyes wide with a manic, cornered desperation. "The banners of the Iron Wolf flew over Crestwood. Your men, your monsters, came in the night. They slaughtered the elders. They burned my father, Beta Thomas Hayes, in the village square. You ordered the purge of the Silver Wolves." Silas froze. The sheer venom in her voice was undeniable, but the words made no sense. Crestwood was a neutral territory, a peaceful sanctuary of silver-furred weavers and miners situated on the western border. They had paid their tithes. They had never rebelled. "Crestwood," Silas repeated, the deadly calm returning to his voice, though it was now laced with a cold, terrifying realization. "Crestwood was under my direct royal protection. I never ordered a purge. I was told the pack succumbed to the Red Blight." "They died by the sword, not sickness," she sobbed, her legs finally giving out. She slid down the brick wall, pulling Leo tightly against her chest. "We ran. I hid my pup in the ashes. And now you found us." Silas watched the life drain from her face as the blood loss and adrenaline crash took their toll. Her eyelids fluttered, and her head lolled forward. "Mama," Leo whispered, shaking her shoulders. "Mama, wake up!" "General Hawthorne!" Silas roared, the command shaking the snow from the rooftops. Hawthorne was beside him in a fraction of a second. "Sire, bring Dr. Percival Graves to the magistrate's manor immediately," Silas ordered, his eyes locked on Rosalind's unconscious form. "If she dies, Hawthorne, I will burn this entire city to the bedrock, and send word to the Capitol Archives. I want every dispatch, every tax record, and every military order concerning Crestwood from the year 1239 on my desk by midnight. It will be done, my king." Silas didn't wait for his men to fetch a carriage. He stepped forward and knelt in the frozen mud. Leo immediately bared his blunt little teeth, standing defensively over his mother's body. Despite his small size, the boy let out a surprisingly deep, resonant growl. Under normal circumstances, a pup growling at an Alpha King was a death sentence, but Silas only felt a strange, fierce swell of pride. "I am not going to hurt her, little warrior," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, smoothing out into a rumbling, soothing purr that alphas only ever used for their own pups. "I am going to fix her, but I need your help to protect her on the way." "Can you do that?" Leo hesitated, his emerald eyes darting from the blood on the snow to the giant man's face. He gave a sharp, single nod. Silas unclasped his heavy, dire wolf fur cloak, the very one Leo had grabbed moments earlier, and wrapped it gently around Rosalind's freezing body. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, cradling her against his armored chest. She weighed nothing to him. With the unconscious woman in his arms and the tiny, fierce boy jogging at his heels, the Alpha King marched out of the slums. The terrified citizens of Oakhaven watched in stunned silence as their ruthless monarch carried a broken seamstress toward the upper city, leaving a trail of blood and shattered tyranny in his wake. When Rosalind finally opened her eyes, she was not in the freezing, soot-stained hovel she called home. She was lying on a massive, feather-stuffed mattress draped in crimson velvet. A roaring fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast a whole stag. The scent of sandalwood and expensive antiseptics filled the air. Panic seized her instantly. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain flared in her neck. "Lie still. Dr. Graves stitched the wound, but moving will tear it." The voice came from the shadows near the hearth. Rosalind turned her head, her breath hitching. King Silas Blackwood sat in a high-backed leather chair, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. He had removed his iron armor, wearing only a dark linen tunic that clung to the heavily muscled planes of his chest and arms. He looked less like a king and more like a weary warrior, his icy blue eyes fixed intently on her. "Where is my son?" Rosalind demanded, ignoring his order and struggling to prop herself up on her elbows. "Right here, Mama!" Leo popped up from the other side of the enormous bed. His face was scrubbed clean of mud, and he was wearing a ridiculously oversized silken shirt. He was clutching a massive, half-eaten roasted pheasant leg. "The grumpy doctor gave me meat, and the tall man said I could eat as much as I want." Rosalind let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, reaching out to stroke Leo's dark hair. But her glare returned as she looked back at Silas. "Am I a prisoner?" "You are under my protection," Silas corrected, his voice flat, though his eyes betrayed a swirling tempest of emotion. "And you are my mate." Rosalind flinched. "I would rather be dead." Silas's jaw tightened. "That can be arranged for those who have actually wronged you. But not for me." He stood up, his massive frame dominating the room. "An hour ago, my men dragged Lord Roderick into the courtyard. I questioned him about Crestwood." Rosalind gripped the velvet blankets. "And? Did he admit to following your orders?" "He admitted to forging them," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. 5 years ago, Roderick and a faction of northern lords wanted the Crestwood silver mines. I denied their petition to annex your lands. So they waited until the winter solstice, when the royal court was distracted, and hired mercenaries. They dressed them in my colors, carried my banners, and slaughtered your people to take the mines. Roderick then reported to the capital that your pack died of a plague, sealing the territory under quarantine so his men could mine the silver in secret. Rosalind stared at him, her mind reeling. He lied. The magistrate killed them. And for that treason, Roderick currently lacks his hands and his tongue, Silas stated coldly. He will be executed at dawn. The men who marched on your home will be hunted down. Every last one of them. I swear this to you, Rosalind. Tears welled in Rosalind's eyes. For 5 years, she had carried the burning hatred of the Alpha King in her chest. To have that foundation suddenly ripped away left her feeling hollow and disoriented. Silas slowly walked toward the bed. He stopped at the foot of it, his eyes drifting down to Leo, who was happily chewing on his pheasant leg, completely oblivious to the heavy political revelations. Silas tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. Now that the overpowering sense of blood, mud, and raw fear had been washed away from the boy, Silas could finally smell him clearly. The king froze. Werewolf genetics were precise. Pups carried the distinct scent of their parents. Silas expected to smell Rosalind's lavender and pine mixed with the scent of whatever dead beta or rogue had fathered the boy. But he didn't. He smelled Rosalind, and he smelled rain on hot iron, deep, ancient earth, the distinct, undeniable scent of the Blackwood royal bloodline. His scent. Silas's heart stopped. He looked at the boy's dark hair, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he fearlessly held the king's gaze. He was 5 years old. "Rosalind," Silas whispered, the air in the room suddenly growing suffocatingly heavy. "Who is his father?" Rosalind's face went paper white. She pulled Leo closer to her. My late husband, a beta of Crestwood. He died in the fires." "You are lying," Silas commanded, the alpha aura slipping out, not aggressively, but with an absolute demand for truth. He stepped closer to the side of the bed. "I know my own blood when I smell it. But I have not shifted, nor have I laid with a woman in 8 years. I was not at Crestwood." Silas closed his eyes, his brilliant tactical mind scanning backward through time, 5 years ago. The winter solstice. His eyes snapped open, blazing with sudden, shocking clarity. "The solstice summit of 1238, Silas breathed out, staring at her. "I was poisoned by an assassin at the banquet. Wolfsbane and Nightshade. I stumbled into the dark catacombs beneath Blackwood Keep to die so my enemies wouldn't see me fall. My beast was feral, burning alive from the venom." Rosalind was shaking her head frantically, pressing herself against the headboard. "Stop, please." "A woman found me," Silas continued, stepping relentlessly closer, his voice cracking with a vulnerability no living soul had ever heard. "A servant, I thought. She didn't call for the guards. She dragged me to an underground spring. She cooled my fever. And when my beast demanded a mate to anchor my soul against the poison, she gave herself to me in the pitch black. She saved my life. When I woke the next morning, the poison was gone. And so was she. I only remembered the scent of lavender." Silas fell to his knees beside the bed. The Iron King, the man who terrified empires, lowered his head until it rested against the mattress near Rosalind's trembling hand. "You were at the summit," Silas whispered, looking up at her with tears swimming in his icy blue eyes. "You came with your father, the beta for the treaty signing." Rosalind let out a broken sob, finally nodding. "I didn't know it was you. It was too dark. You were just a dying wolf. But when you claimed me, I felt the bond snap into place. I knew I had mated an alpha. But the next day, the Crestwood massacre happened. They carried your banners. I thought you used me in the dark, and then sent your men to slaughter my family the very next morning." Silas looked from Rosalind's weeping face to the 5-year-old boy, who was now staring at him with wide, confused emerald eyes. "He grabbed my cloak today," Silas choked out, a wet laugh escaping his lips. "He didn't bow. He demanded my help, because he is an alpha. He is a Blackwood." Silas reached out a massive, trembling hand. Leo didn't pull away. The king gently cupped the boy's cheek. "I am not just your king, little warrior," Silas whispered, a tear finally tracking down his scarred face. "I am your father." The revelation hung in the stifling air of the bedchamber, like a physical weight, suffocating in its magnitude. Rosalind stared at the colossal, terrifying man kneeling on the floor. His massive shoulders, usually carrying the weight of the unified Pax, were shaking with silent, tearless grief. The Iron King, the tyrant she had cursed in the freezing dark for 5 years, was the broken, poisoned wolf she had dragged from the catacombs. He was the father of her child. "You." Rosalind's voice was a hoarse, fractured whisper. She pulled Leo tighter against her side, her mind violently rejecting the truth even as her soul, the dormant mate bond she had suppressed with bitter ash and sheer willpower, began to sing a frantic, joyous melody. The phantom ache in her chest, a hollow space she had carried since that night at the solstice summit, suddenly felt warm and whole. It was you in the dark. You didn't know about Crestwood. I would have burned the world to ash to find you if I had known, Silas swore. His icy blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with a desperate, crushing sincerity that stripped away his royal, terrifying facade. When I woke in that cavern, the poison was purged, but my beaster was screaming for the mate who had anchored us. I ordered my armies to search the continent. I tore apart the ports of Bristol and the highland villages of Oakhaven, looking for a woman smelling of lavender. But my advisors, Chancellor Arthur Penhaligon and Lord Roderick, they told me the assassin's poison had caused a hallucination. They presented forged medical decrees from the High Council. They convinced the court there was no mate. Rosalind's breath hitched. A cold, terrifying realization began to form in her chest, replacing the shock with a dawning horror. Penhaligon, the Chancellor. He drafted the tax laws for the Northern Reaches. He oversaw the trade treaties. He was the one who placed Roderick in power here. Silas's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked visibly beneath his scarred cheek. Slowly, the king rose to his feet. The vulnerability that had cracked his iron shell vanished, replaced by a terrifying, lethal clarity. Roderick was a greedy, bloated fool, Silas murmured, the pieces of a 5-year-old political puzzle finally locking perfectly into place. He didn't have the intelligence, the wealth, or the military influence to hire Black Company mercenaries, dress them in my royal armor, and bypass my border patrols to slaughter the Crestwood wolves. But Penhaligon did. Penhaligon needed the Crestwood silver mines to secretly fund his own private military without the council's oversight. He poisoned me at the banquet, and when I survived, he rushed to bury his tracks by annihilating the only neutral territory wealthy enough to rival his own estates. Before Silas could utter another word, a heavy concussive thud shook the manor's foundation. The stained glass windows rattled in their lead casings. The heavy oak doors of the bedchamber burst open. General Hawthorne rushed in, his black iron armor splattered with fresh rain and something dangerously dark. His breathing was ragged, and his broadsword was already drawn, dripping crimson onto the velvet carpets. "Sire!" Hawthorne barked, his eyes darting to Rosalind and Leo before returning to his king. "We have a critical breach. The magistrates' guards, the ones loyal to Roderick, they've broken ranks and mutinied. But they aren't alone. A massive detachment of High Council enforcers just breached the city gates under the banner of Chancellor Penhaligon." Silas's eyes flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. The temperature in the room plummeted. "Penhaligon is here, in Oakhaven." "He arrived under the cover of the storm, sire. He brought the heavy siege crossbows," Hawthorne reported, his grip on his hilt tightening so hard his knuckles turned white. "He is broadcasting to the city that you have succumbed to the madness of your primordial bloodline. He claims you murdered the magistrate without cause and have been enchanted by a feral rogue witch. They are marching on the manor right now. They outnumber our royal detachment 5-1. Penhaligon isn't here to arrest you, Silas. He's here to finish the assassination he started 5 years ago, and he's going to use the chaos to do it." Rosalind's heart plummeted into her stomach. "He knows," she whispered, looking frantically at Silas. "He has spies. He knows you found me. If you realize the truth about the mate bond, you realize he lied about the poison and ordered the massacre. He has to kill us all tonight to keep the Crestwood silver and usurp the throne." Leo, sensing the sudden, suffocating spike in fear, dropped his half-eaten pheasant leg. He stood up on the mattress, his tiny fists clenched. He didn't look at the bloody sword in Hawthorne's hand or the terrified face of his mother. He looked straight up at his giant father. "Are the bad men coming back?" Leo asked, his voice trembling slightly, but his chin jutting out with that unmistakable stubborn Blackwood defiance. Silas turned to his son. The terrifying Alpha King bypassed his general and knelt by the bed, bringing himself down to the boy's eye level. He reached to his own hand and pulled off a heavy, black iron signet ring, the royal seal of the Iron Wolf. He pressed it into Leo's tiny palm, wrapping the boy's fingers around the cold metal. "No one is going to hurt you or your mother ever again, Leo," Silas said. His voice was a deep, vibrating rumble that commanded the very air in the room to still. It was a promise forged in blood. "Do you remember what I told you in the alley? I asked if you could be a warrior for me." Leo nodded, his emerald eyes wide, clutching the heavy ring to his chest. "I bit the guard." A dark, proud smile touched Silas's lips. "You did. Now, your duty is to stay with General Hawthorne. You protect your mother. I am going to deal with the Chancellor." Silas stood up, throwing off his dark linen tunic. Underneath, his torso was a canvas of silver scars, a testament to a lifetime of brutal warfare. But it wasn't the scars that made Rosalind gasp. It was the way his bones began to audibly pop and shift beneath his skin. The heavy, oppressive scent of rain on hot iron flooded the room, so thick it felt like gravity had doubled. The air pressure dropped violently. "Hawthorne," Silas commanded, his voice already layering with the demonic, guttural growl of his primordial beast. "Barricade this door. If anyone other than me breaches this room, you end them. If I fall, you take my mate and my heir to the Eastern Sea, and you hide them until the boy is old enough to take back his crown." "You won't fall, my king," Hawthorne swore, slamming his bloodied fist over his heart in a fierce, absolute salute. Silas didn't look back. He walked out into the dimly lit stone corridor, his body violently expanding. The agony of the shift, suppressed for 8 long years, tore through him, but it was eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated relief of letting his beast off its leash. Thick, midnight black fur tore through his skin, his spine elongating and snapping into a new, terrifying posture. He fully gave himself over to the primordial monster he had kept locked away, knowing that tonight he didn't need to be a king of laws. He needed to be a god of war. The courtyard of the magistrate's manor was a chaotic maelstrom of freezing rain and clashing steel. Lightning illuminated the night, reflecting off the polished silver armor of Chancellor Penhaligon's elite enforcers. There were over 200 of them, forming a deadly ring around the main entrance of the manor. At the rear of the formation, mounted on a white stallion, sat Chancellor Arthur Penhaligon. He was a slender, aristocratic alpha, with cold grey eyes and a sneer of absolute disdain. "Burn the manor," Penhaligon ordered, his voice carrying over the thunder. "The king has succumbed to the madness of his bloodline. For the safety of the realm, he must be put down." His men raised their blazing torches, ready to hurl them through the stained glass windows. But the heavy oak doors of the manor didn't open. They exploded. A shower of splintered wood and twisted iron hinges rained down on the front lines as a monstrous silhouette stepped out of the darkness. The mercenaries froze. This was not a man. This was a nightmare of the old world. Silas had shifted into his lycanthrope form, a massive, bipedal wolf, standing nearly 9 feet tall, draped in thick, midnight black fur. His claws were the length of short swords, and his eyes burned like twin suns of pure, molten gold. For 8 years, Silas had suppressed the beast, fearing it would consume his humanity. But now, anchored by the presence of his mate and his pup just a few rooms away, The beast wasn't a feral monster. It was a focused, unstoppable weapon of mass destruction. A deafening, earth-shattering roar ripped from Silas's throat. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical shockwave of alpha dominance. Dozens of Penhaligon's men immediately dropped their weapons, their knees buckling as their inner wolves submitted to the true king. "Kill him!" Penhaligon shrieked, his horse rearing in terror. "He is just one beast! Fire the crossbows!" A volley of heavy iron bolts filled the air. Several struck Silas, burying themselves deep into his massive shoulders and chest. He didn't even flinch. He didn't feel the pain. He only felt the rage of a father defending his family. Silas charged. He hit the front lines like a boulder dropping from the sky. Men in heavy armor were thrown through the air like ragged dolls. His claws tore through silver chest plates as easily as parchment. He was a blur of shadows and blood, moving with a speed that defied his massive bulk. He didn't fight with the elegant tactics of a swordsman. He fought with the brutal, absolute violence of an apex predator protecting its den. Upstairs, in the barricaded bedroom, Rosalind listened to the screams echoing from the courtyard. She clutched Leo to her chest, trembling. But as she felt the immense, radiating power of Silas's aura bleeding through the floorboards, something inside her snapped. For 5 years, she had played the victim. She had hidden, cowered, and starved her own wolf to protect her son. She had let men like Briggs and Roderick walk all over her. But she wasn't just a rogue seamstress. She was the daughter of Beta Thomas Hayes. She was a Crestwood wolf, and she was the mate of the Alpha King. "Mama," Leo whimpered, as Rosalind gently set him down on the bed. "Stay with the general, Leo," Rosalind said. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was cold and steady. She stood up. The stitches in her neck tore, bleeding fresh crimson down her collar. But she didn't care. She closed her eyes and reached deep into the dark, neglected corners of her soul. She found the chains she had wrapped around her own beast and shattered them. A brilliant, blinding white light filled the room. Hawthorne shielded his eyes when the light faded. Rosalind was gone. In her place stood a magnificent, silver-furred wolf, her emerald eyes glowing with fierce, maternal fury. She didn't wait for Hawthorne to open the door. She crashed right through the barricaded window, glass shattering around her beautiful silver coat as she plummeted toward the courtyard below. Down in the mud, Silas was surrounded. He had decimated half the Chancellor's forces, but he was bleeding heavily from dozens of wounds. Penhaligon, seeing the king slowing down, had dismounted and drawn a sword coated in highly concentrated liquid wolfsbane. "You were always a brute, Silas," Penhaligon sneered, stepping behind a wall of shield-bearers, ready to strike the killing blow while the king was distracted. Before Penhaligon could swing, a streak of pure silver lightning dropped from the sky. Rosalind landed directly on top of the Chancellor, her jaws clamping down on his sword arm with bone-crushing force. Penhaligon screamed as his weapon dropped into the mud. The silver wolf didn't relent. She tore her claws across his chest, standing over his bleeding body and letting out a ferocious, echoing howl that pierced the storm. Silas turned, his golden eyes widening. Amidst the blood and the rain, he saw her, his mate, radiant, deadly, and fighting for him. The sight of the silver wolf sent a surge of limitless energy through Silas's veins. With a final terrifying roar, he shattered the remaining shield wall, his massive claws finding the throats of the last mercenaries standing. Seeing their chancellor bleeding in the mud beneath the jaws of a silver wolf, the remaining enforcers broke and ran, dropping their weapons in absolute surrender. The courtyard fell silent, save for the pounding rain and the crackle of burning torches. Silas, still in his massive lichen form, breathed heavily. He dropped to all fours, his bones cracking as he shifted back into his human state. He knelt in the blood-soaked mud, completely naked, his body covered in wounds that were already steaming and closing. Rosalind released the whimpering Chancellor, who was quickly dragged away by Hawthorne's arriving reinforcements, and shifted back to her human form. She stood in the freezing rain, shivering, her torn clothes soaked. Silas looked up at her, waiting. He had shown her the monster he was. He waited for the fear, for the rejection he had seen in the alley. Instead, Rosalind walked through the mud. She ignored the blood, the carnage, and the rain. She dropped to her knees right in front of him. She reached out, her delicate hands cupping his rough, scarred face. "You came back for me," Rosalind whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "In the dark, 5 years ago. And today, I will always come back for you," Silas swore, leaning his forehead against hers. "You are my heart, Rosalind. My soul. My queen." She didn't pull away. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The mate bond, suppressed for half a decade, finally snapped completely into place. A shockwave of pure, golden magic erupted from the two of them, washing over the courtyard. The rain seemed to stop. The heavy, oppressive air of Oakhaven cleared, replaced by the overwhelming scent of winter pine, lavender, and rain on hot iron. From the shattered window above, a tiny voice yelled, "Did we win?" Silas pulled back from the kiss, a genuine, blinding smile breaking across his face for the first time in a decade. He looked up at his son, leaning dangerously far out the broken window. "Yes, little warrior," the Alpha King called back, pulling Rosalind tightly against his chest. "We won." History books in the Unified Pax rarely speak of the Red River Trade Treaty or the winter of 1244. Instead, scholars write of the seamstress queen and the miraculous resurrection of the Iron King's soul. Following the execution of Arthur Penhaligon for high treason, King Silas and Queen Rosalind rebuilt the Crestwood territory, transforming it from a graveyard into the thriving, heavily fortified jewel of the northern reaches. As for the little boy who bravely grabbed a tyrant's cloak to save his mother, Crown Prince Leo grew into a ruler far greater than his father. Blending the ruthless tactical brilliance of the Blackwood line with the deep, empathetic spirit of the Silver Wolves, Leo's eventual reign ushered in 3 centuries of unbroken peace. It stands as a timeless reminder. The greatest empires are not forged by swords, but saved by the fierce, unwavering love of a family reunited.